operation in the shortest possible time as a matter of urgency. The refinery is now in routine maintenance mode, almost 2 weeks beyond the projected time. We are aware that this has created some supply disruptions, mainly in the supply of bitumen for the production of asphalt. And 3, to examine the management systems, including accounting, administrative, procurement, and human resource management, for obvious weaknesses and make the necessary changes, both in systems and personnel, to ensure the effective operations of the company in the short term. Mr. Speaker, earlier today, the General Manager of Petrojam agreed to separate from the company. New arrangements will shortly be announced for the management leadership of the entity. Mr. Speaker, our review of the Permanent Secretary's report and interview of senior personnel in the Energy Division and Petrojam reveal that the process of approval of travel by board members needs greater oversight. All travel of public officials, which would include board members, must be recommended by the Permanent Secretary for the Cabinet Secretary's approval. That was the policy. However, it is not always the case that ministers who appoint board members are aware of travel requests. Not always the case. Some ministers are aware, permanent secretaries may notify a minister. But with 200 and odd boards, it is not always possible that that will happen. The reason for this consideration, Mr. Speaker, is that the travel of a politically appointed person, such as a board chairman, can become a political issue. And therefore, the minister who does the appointment can be exposed. And therefore, there's nothing wrong with the minister being informed of the person who he appoints of their travel. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, the process would now be that the travel would go through the permanent secretary as it does. The permanent secretary would seek the approval that this is something that the government approves of, the chairman traveling. And once that is settled, then the administrative issues around traveling, whether the class of travel, the cost of hotel, the per diem, those are administrative issues now that the permanent secretary approves of. It then goes to the cabinet secretary, who makes an overall decision about the delegation that is going to travel. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that is a tidy arrangement and gives far greater scrutiny and oversight to public expenditure relating to travel. Mr. Speaker, so whether or not the board member is going to travel, from Jamaica to a conference or from overseas to Jamaica to attend a board meeting or from Jamaica to overseas to attend a board meeting, those travels now must go through this process. Another weakness identified from our examination of the report was that in approving board members, Cabinet was not always aware of the residential status of persons being proposed for board membership in Jamaica. Chairman, there's no, Mr. Speaker, Cabinet was not always aware. There's no, Mr. Speaker, just to be clear, and Mr. Speaker, I know I should not respond to the Sotovoce remarks, but for clarity, Mr. Speaker, remember the minister, we expect the minister to know the overseas, or rather the residential status, but not necessarily Cabinet. In other words, a submission could come to Cabinet which does not have that detail. And I am agreeing with you, it should not. But presently, under the current rules, it could. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, what we are doing now is to further refine those rules about the submission of a cabinet submission seeking the approval of someone to be chairman. Mr. Speaker, and for good reason why we should know this, because if we were to approve someone who genuinely lives overseas to sit on a board, there is almost an implicit expectation that you pay for their travel. Yes, but remember now, you have cabinet. So, Mr. Speaker, it is necessary, and it will redound for the benefit of future governments, that this is now a requirement. And in the simple way, Mr. Speaker, that it is a requirement that when you when you put in a submission requesting approval for a board member, you have to submit along with it resume of the member and the laws supporting the appointment of the board. Those are standard accompanying documents. So now a standard accompanying piece of information must be the residential status, so that cabinet is not making a decision unwittingly. That cabinet is making a decision with full knowledge. Note, Mr. Speaker, it is not the intention of this new guideline to in any way cut off the avenue of service for people in the diaspora, Jamaicans in the diaspora. But all we are saying is that the cabinet must be fully aware of the implications of the appointment. Mr. Speaker, the area of donations and corporate social responsibility was a glaring weakness in the Petrojam matter, and potentially could be an area of systemic weakness across government. The policy guidelines for corporate social responsibility does call for the drafting of specific regulations and guidelines to create a more robust framework. The House will recall that Principle 20 of the Corporate Governance Framework for Public Bodies provided for the development of a policy concerning CSR, corporate social responsibility, inclusive of donations and sponsorships. This was not yet done, and Cabinet has since given direction to the Minister of Finance as to the details of those guidelines and regulations. One, the Ministry of Finance must establish a ceiling for donations under which the board approves. So there must be a ceiling, whether it is going to be 100,000, 50,000, but there must be a ceiling that the board approves. The ministry must establish the number of times a single applicant may benefit. So if you have a ceiling, you could still breach the ceiling by applicants coming over and over again. So we have to set a limit to the number of times an applicant can benefit within a budget cycle. The Ministry of Finance must establish uniformed application and approval processes, which include requirements for the disclosure of connected party relations. So if you are applying to a company, you should disclose that my brother works there, or my neighbor works there, or girlfriend. And if you are approving, if you are part of the approving body, then you should disclose that we are approving, but important disclosure is that I know the beneficiary. Mr. Speaker, if the entity wishes to make donations above the ceiling, then such donations should be channeled to a grant-making agency of the government, whose mandates support the evaluation, approval, monitoring, and securing value for purpose from the funds granted. Now, an entity in keeping with its corporate social responsibility mandate that would like to assist with major works to a basic school, for example, that is within its area, would now be required to pass those funds to NET, or to Chase, or to TEF, to whichever, in keeping with the area of focus of that particular granting agency. This, we believe, will streamline public bodies' donations, it will secure value for public funds, and ensure that government entities are focused on their core mandate. All self-financing agencies must specifically include their donation and corporate social responsibility program in the draft budget estimates prepared for submission to the Ministry of Finance and for eventual approval by Parliament. So no longer will it be subsumed under some other heading. They must have a specific line item. They must explain specifically what it is that they intend to achieve. And when it comes here in the supplementary book, the corporate bodies book, we as Parliament would be able to look and say, this is what this company plans to give, what this company plans to give. Well, we will eventually approve it. Mr. Speaker, after deep consideration, it was also decided that entities that are funded from the consolidated fund will no longer be allowed to allocate a budget for CSR and donations, except for matters dealing with HR and staff welfare. So if you come to think of it, Mr. Speaker, why should any entity, let's grab any entity's name, speaking hypothetically, why should NWA have a donations budget? That element of government should be given over to agencies that have that specific mandate. And so, Mr. Speaker, we have taken that decision. We have given the instruction to the Ministry to the Minister of Finance. He would have obviously instructed the staff that this will now be the new regulatory environment for donations. I'm certain, Mr. Speaker, that this will prevent the reoccurrence of any issues such as those that occurred in the Petrojam matter. Mr. Speaker, another area of concern is that of retainer contracts. After careful consideration, all sole source retainer contracts will require prior approval by Cabinet. All other retainer contracts must be brought to the attention of the Cabinet. In either case, declarations regarding connected persons, board or management, are to be included in the relevant submissions to Cabinet. In addition, all retainer contracts must be included in the annual reports. The Ministry of Finance will also need to incorporate these requirements into the procurement policy and filtered into legislation as appropriate. Mr. Speaker, let me take a little time to explain this point. Retainer contracts are a special kind of contract. It is usually used to secure services which may not necessarily be provided. For example, you may retain a lawyer. The lawyer is on call. Or an entertainment company. But, Mr. Speaker, this is an area that when you really examine it, is open to abuse. Especially if it is sole sourced or direct contracting, as most retainer contracts are. And so we have identified this, Mr. Speaker, as not only a weakness in Petrojam, but potentially a systemic weakness across public bodies. And therefore, these new rules, we are not seeking to say that you can't have retainer contracts because it may be necessary. But the mischief that we have to correct is to ensure that if there are connected parties, that they are discovered by declaration, that there is a process of declaring connected parties. Yes, so, and that all retainer contracts come to Cabinet, that the Infrastructure Committee is made aware of these retainer contracts, regardless of value. But those that are sole source, must get the approval of cabinet, regardless of value. So when they come to cabinet, they must declare, board members and management, if there are any connected party relations, they must declare it in the submission. We must see that. And cabinet must approve it, go through the rigor of asking the questions, and approve it. Mr. Speaker, this is an important step in ensuring that this kind of contracting is not abused. Mr. Speaker, let me state that on transferring the energy portfolio to OPM, I have had intensive briefings on the energy portfolio in relation to policy matters and general administration matters of the portfolio. Generally speaking, based on my briefings and questioning, I am not seeing a general policy or administrative failure in the energy division. No. But clearly, there are specific issues at Petrojam. And this is my initial response, having only had the portfolio for a few days. But so far, what I have been able to gather from my meetings with the officers and the new permanent secretary and the various managers within that division. And the division, I mean, energy is a big issue, but the division is a small division. And I know I'm speaking of the Central Ministry Administration. So you would have, within the energy division, you would have NESAL, you would have PCJ and Petrojam, you would have the ethanol, you would have the ministry apparatus itself. So it's not a big, the division is really responsible for the energy policy. And the energy policy is being implemented. The energy policy is a national policy. So in terms of the energy division, activities are on stream to continue to implement the energy policy and to create a more transparent infrastructure through changes to the legislative framework and the effective implementation of legislation such as the Electricity Act. Mr. Speaker, even while I've outlined these policy changes, I must emphasize that more fundamentally, the future of Petrojam has to be the subject of urgent, critical strategic review, particularly in light of the changing energy landscape. For example, the transition from HFO to LNG, changes in quality requirements, use of renewables, among other factors. Petrojam requires strategic review of both its management and operations, as well as its long-term commercial viability and role in Jamaica's energy security. Among the factors that give rise to the need for this review are the non-cooperation of our Venezuelan partners to enable the start of the infrastructure upgrade, which, Mr. Speaker, we have been talking about since 2006, when the refinery was, when 49% of the refinery was sold to our Venezuelan friends. And, Mr. Speaker, there was a joint venture agreement which spoke to the upgrade. And to this day, we are still talking about the upgrade. In that period of time, Mr. Speaker, so much has changed. Certainly from 2006. So, Mr. Speaker, then we weren't contemplating that almost 70%, if not 80% of JPS's fuel would be LNG. At that time, we were talking about the use of a cogeneration pet coke facility, which, again, never happened. So now, Mr. Speaker, we have to now vision what the next decade will look like for Petrojam and the investments that we plan to make, whether or not they make sense. Because that is where we are with Petrojam. In a few months, Petrojam will lose a major part of its energy stream when JPS converts to LNG. If we are not in a position to produce the cleaner type of fuels that we need, we won't be able to supply an emerging, growing market for clean fuel for ships. Petrojam could very well just become a terminal. So, Mr. Speaker, there is urgent, critical need for a strategic review. And even more so when the organization is losing focus and straying from the policy guidelines and placing public funds at risk. The government, Mr. Speaker, cannot sit idly by and allow this to happen. The government must act, and we are acting to ensure that Petrojam can have a good, solid future for the people of Jamaica. So Cabinet has therefore noted the need to put in place a team to assist government and the board to determine the strategic directions of the organization, as well as to assist in organizational restructuring to enable the entity to realize the plans cast. I have already had discussions with Mr. Christopher Zaka, who has agreed to chair this team, and consultations are underway with a view to the appointment of other qualified professionals to serve on the team. The terms of reference will be finalized in short order, and I expect to be in a position to announce the full members of this committee by the next sitting of Parliament. The government, by its action, is showing that it is concerned about the serious allegations made and has engaged a process that is designed to establish facts in the haystack of allegations. Whatever we are able to verify with our limited powers of investigation and discovery, we have acted upon them, and we have kept the public informed of our actions. This government is serious about building a culture of accountability. Accountability is a spectrum of actions, starting with an agent, the cabinet, the main agent or the main principle of policy, reporting to a principle of authority, the parliament from which the government is drawn. The report to Parliament, however, Mr. Speaker, must be on facts.
Facts, not fiction.
The leader of the opposition last week raised some fundamental issues about ministerial responsibility. And I was exchanging with him across the aisle how important that is, and that when we speak about ministerial responsibility, we shouldn't shroud it in any issue that may confuse the public. The leader of the opposition was right in his assertion that ministerial responsibility means that the minister is responsible for all policy and all actions undertaken in the ministry assigned. But what does this responsibility mean? It means that the minister is responsible to come to Parliament and give an account. The first element of account is to give a report and place on record what happened. That is the responsibility of government. That is the responsibility of the minister. And that is what is meant when we start to now talk about accountability. And so the government has started to fulfill its role in the spectrum of accountability. We have come and we have given an account, but the account cannot be, Mr. Speaker, on hearsay, on allegations, on innuendos. The account has to be on facts. And what we have done, Mr. Speaker, so, Mr. Speaker, on facts. So when you go to the PAC, you're trying to do that. You're trying to find facts. And we have done the same. In executing our responsibility, we have engaged a process of identifying what's factual. Now, Mr. Speaker, the facts that we have discovered, we have come here openly and said, These are the weaknesses. And we have taken action, Mr. Speaker, to correct them. Mr. Speaker, I am told that the Auditor General will in short order deliver her report. The member from Central Manchester had raised the issue of why mobilize the Public Accountability Inspectorate when so many other agencies were there. And I take the point, and especially now since the Auditor General has indicated that she will give an early report, then, Mr. Speaker, it's not necessary to mobilize the Public Accountability Inspectorate. Whatever issues are raised in those reports, whether it is from the Auditor General or from the Integrity Commission, the government will act. MOCA is acting in support of the Integrity Commission. Whatever issues are raised, the government will act to address them. This government has nothing to hide, and we are not shielding anyone, and we are not covering up anything. We want to get at the truth. The government has acted proportionately and appropriately to what is manifest and evident. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Excellent.
Dr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has, in a lengthy statement that has been presented to us as the final item this evening, indicated that his government is committed to accountability. He has also implied that there were breaches in the administration of Petrojam. He has said so, and implied that others will be held accountable. For example, we are told that earlier today, the general manager has agreed to separate from the organization, I believe was the word used. We were told last week that he had for personal reasons to leave the island. Maybe he returned, maybe he didn't. But at least by implication, that is one official who is being held accountable. The board also resigned. The previous board, a new board, was held accountable. A central issue is whether the minister should also be held accountable. Now, we start from the vantage point in our system of democracy that we operate, Westminster type operations, that the cabinet and collectively is the principal body responsible for policy. We are agreed. Section 69 also says that the cabinet is responsible for the general direction and control, end quote, of the government. Now, the issue then arises is whether adequate control and adequate direction was exercised by the minister And if it was exercised, these things would not have happened, one must presume. If it was not exercised, then there's a breach, obviously, and there is collective responsibility implied. Now, the Prime Minister has suggested that there is in fact has indicated, to be accurate, that there is a whole range of adjustments to how donations are to be made, how travel is to be organized and approved, how residency is to be communicated to the cabinet. But with respect, these represent an effort, these adjustments, an effort to systematize common sense positions that have been observed by almost every single cabinet in the history of the country before this. The Prime Minister himself has said the energy division is not large. It involves a couple of agencies, Petrojam, Nesal, he says, and that he himself, in his briefings, examined the policy issues and the administrative issues. Now it is in informing yourself, as he properly did, as now the minister, of these administrative issues, that every minister should be informing himself regularly in the course of his ministerial responsibilities of the situation in respect of the agencies for which he is responsible. Now, the question arises that given the litany of failings and breaches of performance which occurred in Petrojam, we have issues of travel by the chairman. According to information given by the management team of Petrojam to the PAAC, on which representatives of both sides of the House are present, there were 26 trips that were reimbursed in 18 months. That there was travel that was scheduled to occur on the day the meetings finished and extend for a period beyond. But that's a detail. There were breaches in the hiring of staff. There was misrepresentation about the qualifications of staff hired, which made their qualifications inferior to the staff fired, and yet they're paid more. There was a failure of the board to meet. There was apparent fraud in donations. Who committed the fraud may not be clear, but he's acknowledging in the need to create these new arrangements that something went awry. Something went dreadfully awry to the tune of millions of dollars. That there were procurement breaches that were extensive. If that doesn't meet the standard for which someone should be held accountable, God knows what would in his government. it is not that we are suggesting, and in fact in some jurisdictions, it wouldn't arise, not that we are suggesting that the minister must be personally responsible for what takes place in every area. He may not be personally responsible, but he is accountable to the public, and there is a difference. Now, in the Prime Minister, in the Prime Minister's statement, there's another critical theme that arises, and namely the energy security of the country. I want to suggest that both things are linked. I want to suggest that both things are linked. Simply put, as the old adage says, bad money drives out good. If you want to prepare Petrojam to be efficient and good, if you are seeking partners and you want the cooperation of the Venezuelans, then you have to assure them, not only the Venezuelans, but everyone else in the world who may be interested, that Jamaica has a government that takes accountability seriously, and that if there are breaches that are involved, that someone will be held accountable, and that the politically appointed officials and the political officials themselves are not immune from these requirements of accountability. On the specific matter of Venezuela, I think we are faced with an issue of fact and an issue of our reliability as a country, as a partner with other countries. The Venezuelans, with whom we entered into a partnership in 2006, the Venezuelans were entered into partnership with a view of upgrading the refinery. At that time, Jamaica relied very much on the benefits of the Petro-Carib agreement, as we did during the period 2007 to 11, during the previous administration of the Jamaica Labour Party, and as we did subsequently after 2012 through to 16.
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the time being 7:20, I ask that the House be permitted to sit beyond 7:30 to enable it to complete the business of the day.
The question is that the time being 7:20 p.m., that the House be allowed to sit beyond 7:30 p.m. to complete the business of the day. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Dr. Phillips.
Yes, but you spoke for 20. Yes, but you...
Well, I was asking myself the question when you were expounding, and I said he had important things to say. You're supposed to speak for 12 in the standing orders, ministerial statement. Read it. And I am to speak for 5. He extended beyond 12 to about 25. Pari passu. I am demanding the same treatment. No. If you, I will not be muzzled. Let the member speak. I will not sit. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, the Venezuelan matter is of fundamental importance, and the record should be straight. They purchased an interest in the refinery. We were benefiting from the purchase of oil under the Petrocaribe agreement at a time when oil prices rose in excess of 100, in excess of 120, in excess of 150, and quite frankly, Jamaica literally would not have been able to survive without the Petrocaribe benefit. When they were prepared to make the investment in the expansion, when they were prepared, the government of Jamaica, under the strictures of a then very, very constraining IMF program, was not in the position to find the funds to make our contribution at the time. And so, what I'm suggesting, yes, and then now, what arises is simply this. In going forward, we need to approach it not from the point of view of a diktat or a friction-filled relationship with our Venezuelan partners. We need to approach it from the vantage point of friends who have had need of each other in order to survive in a turbulent global environment. We must also approach it from the vantage point of us providing clear evidence of clean governance and robust accountability structures that will enable not just our Venezuelan partners, but any third-party partner which we might want to embrace in order to be able to give substance to our mutual desire to upgrade this refinery. The final point I would make, Prime Minister, is this. You say you are doing your investigations, but it is evident from what has been provided to the PAAC that the problem is not a Petrojam problem any longer. The problem apparently extends to Nessal, where we know that investigations are taking place involving senior officers in possession of huge amounts of cash. Yes, one of the officers. One of the officers involving, okay. Well, we will know. We will know whether it's more than one. We know also that there are issues arising in relation to the Universal Service Fund and the hiring of staff. We know also that there is a question of a huge staff turnover in eGov. So, what you have, Prime Minister, is a crisis that is spreading like a cancer through tissue. And what we know from experience is that failure to send a clear signal to the country and to the government that there are standards of accountability that are expected by the highest official in the land, which is the Prime Minister. Failure to send that signal will only provide encouragement to those who may want to breach the obligations that are set out in our Constitution and in the various ministry papers. As I said before, these are not new discoveries. Every minister, there's ministry paper, I believe it is number 19 of 2002. It was prepared by a different administration, but it is commonsensical accounts of what the expectations of a minister. And if it is not rescinded explicitly, it remains the policy, binding governments, and in this instance, guiding ministers. There is the FAA Act. There's the Public Bodies Management Act. And there's a whole range of practices with which most permanent secretaries would be familiar. And indeed, I believe the permanent secretary in energy would have been familiar. Ministers routinely call their board chairmen collectively, in most instances, or separately, to account for what is going on. What's the state of affairs? Permanent secretaries routinely have a representative on a board, or if not, have direct communication. There is an accountable officer written to by the Minister of Finance in all of these agencies, who has a responsibility to ensure that fiduciary responsibilities are met. So, Prime Minister, while the changes may be positive in the areas of reporting, they are only, in a sense, updating principles that have been long recognized and practices which have long been in place. We can have changes, but these changes should not detract from the fact that there needs to be a clear signal of accountability. And it is the case, if I am to listen to you, what you said in 2013 and earlier periods. You used to believe those things were important then. And I'm urging you, revisit them, Prime Minister.
Mr. Paul.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some follow-up questions to the Prime Minister. He won't allow me to make any statements. But yes. Okay, no, fair enough. Prime Minister, I want to look at the current structure of the government in light of what you have done in relation to this important subject known as energy, because it now falls at OPM, which has really become, I believe, an overloaded area of the government. Perhaps you could explain which of your ministers will be responsible for energy, because I can't see, in light of all the urgent matters that you have to deal with here, who that you would personally deal with it. So probably you could indicate to us that. But more important, Prime Minister, you now have a single Ministry of Science and Technology. And I know the importance of science and technology. I was the minister. But Prime Minister, with respect, I can't see the justification in having a single Ministry of Science and Technology. In fact, what you have done is split up an organization that has taken some time to build, that had shared services, that has one letterhead that will now be changed. The cost of that exercise is going to be tremendous. So I want to put that on the table for you to respond to. Prime Minister, last week I did ask the Minister about certain aspects of Petrojam, and I don't think I got satisfactory answers in relation to some things that came out of an audit that was done. And you always remind me that the audit was spanning 2015 to 17. But I'm very concerned about certain purchases that were done in relation to emergency purchases. The PDVSA, right. That there were certain purchases were done based off a contract with a certain supplier facilitated by a local dealer who boasts about being able to provide products at much lower prices than Petrojam, which created quite a stir in the marketplace. We were purchasing through them, and I really want to understand why that was done, and importantly, whether we are continuing, especially because I can't see the justification in these emergency purchases. And of course, the allegation is that the prices were higher. No allegations. In the audit, it was clear that per shipment, we were losing somewhere between 350 to 400,000 US per shipment on these products. Prime Minister, I have taken your former minister to task because one of the ways we were able to pull the energy sector after we agreed on an energy policy was to establish an energy council. And that council comprised all the stakeholders in the business. And at the time, I included the opposition. And it worked well. Yes. In fact, I remember when you were calling for my resignation, he didn't call. He didn't call because he understood everything because he was there at the table taking decisions. Yes, the Prime Minister did. Yes, ma'am. But his minister, his spokesperson, didn't support it because we had an open and transparent. So, Prime Minister, I really want to understand the future of the Energy Council, which is was an effective tool for bringing the stakeholders together to agree, to come to consensus on these matters. Prime Minister, also, I want to take you now to the issue of the upgrade. Yes, because it is my understanding that, and I see that you have put the blame almost squarely on the Venezuelans. And I think it's unfortunate because I am aware at one point when they were prepared to go in the period between 2008 and 2012. I am not too sure what were the specific reasons why the government of Jamaica couldn't go, but they were willing to proceed with their part of the bargain, but we didn't have the money. Yes, sure. No, the government of Jamaica doesn't have the money now. Doesn't have the money now. So, Prime Minister, it is my understanding on the road, and I don't like to bring hearsay to Parliament, but the word is that the government is seeking to sell.
Mr. Powell, just asking you to stick to the questions.
Yes, that's what I'm doing, Mr. Speaker. No, the Prime Minister is still. Yes. No, I want to know whether or not, because the Prime Minister started to speak about divestment. And I hear that there are some persons lining up to take for cheap Petrojam. So I want to be assured that the divestment is not the priority. And that, because if you were to divest now, there's nothing really to divest. There's no real value there unless you proceed to do the upgrade. And in relation to the upgrade, I am not too sure the role of this committee that has been established, especially because it appears as if you are proceeding without a major partner's involvement, the partner that owns 49% of the shares. Yes, of course. No, I want to make sure that the government does the right thing, and not divest to friends. Of course, but I have been at pains when the minister came here to give a blow-by-blow report on the negotiations. I cautioned him because I believe it was unnecessary. But I also said that I would not comment in any way on those processes because I didn't want to in any way affect the negotiation, and we were siding with the government of Jamaica. We want the government of Jamaica to succeed in the way we intended for Petrojam to operate. Of course, but not blindly. It cannot be that you are thinking of divesting to friends. Prime Minister, I would love if you could just address those for me. I have about 2 more issues I want to raise, but I really want to. No, but they are follow-up. They are follow-up. They are follow-up.
Mr. Speaker, the member raised important questions which I myself have contemplated. I didn't take on the energy portfolio lightly without serious contemplation of how it would affect the load at OPM and what it would mean for the rest of the government. But, Mr. Speaker, I've oftentimes been asked the question, how do you take on so many things? And the issue is, ability and capacity. So if you have ability and capacity, you can take on, but everybody must know their limits. So there is a limit, and I think, Mr. Speaker, I'm just saying that generally you can take on as much work as your ability and capacity allow. So what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is that the member's point is valid, and it is within my consideration that there will have to be some rearrangements to have an even distribution of work throughout the government. Of course, it doesn't all happen with the snap of a finger. Certain things have to be put in place, and I'm working towards that. Mr. Speaker, I also considered whether or not it would be costly, as you have put it, to have the transition. Mr. Speaker, there's no real cost other than probably the change of letterhead. They remain where they are. The shared services are not necessarily interrupted. There is a change in reporting directly now to me as the minister and to the permanent secretary. But the division has a very competent chief technical officer and other officers who operate and manage the portfolio. And then, of course, there are the agencies that are statutory bodies that operate according to the rules. From my perspective, what really needs to happen now is as I've said, a strategic review, what of the future of Petrojam, and putting that in place with private sector support, civil society support, broad stakeholder support to determine that can only be in the best interest. The member from Central Manchester, in his questioning of me 2 weeks ago, raised the issue of, is the VDU necessary? Conflicting positions. So I think for such an important investment and such an important asset, nothing is wrong with taking a few weeks, even a few months, but not very long, to do an assessment to make sure that we are making the right decision for the future. There is no predetermined position of the government about the asset, other than what would be in keeping with our policy of maximum utilization of public assets. Presently, as it stands, the potential of the refinery is not fully utilized. And you have admitted that in your question, that the value of it now is really nothing, but it could have so much more if certain things were done. Now, let's be clear. The government of Jamaica, meaning either administration, have always had good relations with our Venezuelan friends. They were there when we needed help. They supported us with supplies of oil when oil prices were very high. There is no intent to be ungrateful to a friend. There's no intent for that. But, Mr. Speaker, the government must always act in the interest of Jamaica. I am an agent of Jamaica and no other state. When I stand here to declare policy options, it is on behalf of the people of Jamaica only. Mr. Speaker, the situation as it now stands, and I'm not saying that it has always been the case, is that our Venezuelan brothers and partners in this joint venture have not been willing to agree to the refinery upgrade. And it is not for want of asking, of negotiating, of seeking all kinds of interventions to get to the table. In 2007 May, we received, 2016 May, we received a very welcome visit from President Maduro. He had a few hours stopover in Jamaica. No, he spent a day with us, I believe, in Jamaica. And we had a long meeting, very good meeting, and I raised a question with him directly about the approval for the refinery upgrade. The commitment was that in 3 months they would get back to us with a decision. That would have been August 2016. In January 2017, I went to the Dominican Republic to attend a CELAC meeting. At that meeting, we ended up signing an MOU of sorts, a memorandum of intent to proceed with the refinery upgrade. And then we had several visits. We eventually saw that there was no true response coming, and we sent the Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs to Venezuela to make an offer to purchase their shares. To date, the offer has not been accepted. So the decision was made to proceed with an aspect of the upgrade, which is the VDU. The government of Jamaica has decided to spend $100 million US on the refinery upgrade. This is, of course, without any participation from our Venezuelan partners. Mr. Speaker, the upgrade of the refinery, in my opinion, is important. As to the nature of it, the form of it, what we decide to do. So I'm coming to that question because I know you want to ask it, so let me just answer it from now. The format of what the government does has to contemplate the changing environment. As I said earlier, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, we weren't contemplating LNG to replace. We were talking about a petcoke cogeneration facility with JPS and Petrojam. It didn't happen. Now we have LNG that could basically replace the entire electricity generation capacity. It could eventually replace our transportation fleet for public passenger transport. What of Petrojam then? So that's one issue of its viability commercially. The next issue is, how should it be owned? So for energy security, does it mean that the government must own it or that Jamaican shareholders should own it? Is it just 10 Jamaicans should own it, or should it be on the stock exchange where all of Jamaica could potentially own it? These are considerations that have to be well thought out. I don't believe, with everything else as you have said that I have to do, that I could just sit around the table with the cabinet and make the decision. Let's ask some people who have some technical skills, as well as who could relate with people who have direct technical skills, to come up with an understanding that could come back here and we debate it as a parliament. That's the idea behind it. So the short answers to your question is, yes, I have concerns. Yes, I acknowledge the limits. Yes, I will have to reorganize the government. In terms of the audit report, now, curiously, the audit report was never sent to the minister. It was circulated to members of the board and to some management people. I eventually got a copy, having searched very hard for it. So I will, but you had it before, so obviously, so there is some, some direct connection there. We understand. But Mr. Speaker, I am now present. I have a physical copy of the report, and I'm going through it, and I'm going to be raising these issues and responding to close the gaps that are raised in that PDVSA audit report. The other issue which you raised, and you raised it before, and let me see if I'm capturing correctly. You're saying that in the report of the Venezuelans about the management and operations, that there is an activity at Petrojam in which Petrojam engaged in a contract for emergency supply, with the price being above market, but the supply was not taken on an emergency basis. And therefore it raises the question whether or not the use of emergency procedures and emergency prices was just a guise to give somebody a sweet deal. That is the essence of your suspicion. And remember, as I said, I've just gotten the report. I am going to go through it in detail, and believe me, like you, I am interested to know if this is fact, and once we have established that, we will act. Now, Mr. Speaker, the issue of pricing at Petrojam and procurement is not a matter that is only to this administration. It is a matter that is, yes, across administration, Mr. Speaker. And I want it to be clear that the leader of the opposition, in his statement, has basically said, don't do anything about management. It's about the minister. Now, let's be clear. Let's be clear. Well, as long as you're saying that it is both, as long as you're saying that there are some things that we cannot, as Parliament, ignore about what is happening in terms of management, because there are many issues, many decisions taken, of which ministers have no clue. And the actions would be going against the policy guidelines. So like this now, I would want to know whether or not the former minister was responsible, but I would also want to know which management person took the decision about pricing, because the truth is that the minister has nothing to do with the pricing. I spent last night, sitting down with both the former manager of Petrojam, Mr. Winston Watson, and the entire team from the energy division, asking about pricing and how pricing is done. And they were clear. Minister has nothing to do with pricing and procurement. Now, that's the point. So the minister is responsible to bring these errors to Parliament and report on them and take action. Sorry. Yes, the cabinet first, and then here. And so what I'm saying is, member, that I too want to find out what happened, because this is always an area in which it could be exploited. Who knows? Maybe it is that in the purchase of fuel on the spot market, that higher prices have been accepted, and I'm just speaking now hypothetically. Higher prices may have been accepted when there could have been lower prices accepted. Who pays that cost? But importantly, who benefits? Who is involved in these potential arrangements? These are things that we must investigate and find out.
Prime Minister, I have two follow-up questions. You had mentioned in the report the issue of current situation at Petrojam, where there is a problem with asphalt. And I did make a statement 2 weeks ago about asphalt. And I noted that there was a shortage and it was denied. So you're confirming that there is a problem with asphalt. Secondly, just going back to the pricing, because you know, Prime Minister, when you go to the pump now to purchase a liter of your favorite fuel, the price you pay now is more than you were paying when the price per barrel of oil was $150. The price per barrel today is in the region about 60, 70. Yes, 74. What you're paying now, the Jamaican consumer is paying now. In that price, Prime Minister, and you are the Minister of Energy, and the Minister of Finance isn't here, but in that price, you have something called some hedge money that, well, the Jamaican consumers, they are calling for a break because the government is collecting this money for a hedge. There is no hedge, so it is really being collected under false pretense. And the Jamaican people would like to get back this money into their pocket. The price per liter of fuel is burdensome. And as a result of that, even with the transformation taking place with JPSCO, the price of electricity is also moving up.
Remember, I can only agree with you that the pricing mechanism that pertains at Petrojam needs oversight and review. There is no hiding from that. We have always raised questions. In fact, the former Minister of Finance raised that in his budget presentation, that the margins have been going up from the marketing companies, whilst the global indicative prices have been going down. But my real interest, Minister, and that will be a part of the review, to look at the pricing mechanism of Petrojam, because that is also important because it is passed on to JPS. It's a large part of the bill that consumers pay. So we are interested in understanding how it works, that it is transparent, and that the customer is not being asked to pay more because of any maladministration or corruption. So I want to give you the assurance, member, that this is something that I am interested in, and we will look at that directly.
House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Bunty.
I have a few questions on the Prime Minister's statement. Prime Minister, you spoke to the accountability of ministers, and you were specific about one element of it: the reporting, the obligation to report to Parliament, whether directly to MPs' questions or through committees. But I'm sure as you're going through the literature on this element of accountability of ministers, you would have seen that there was a second element. The first was, yes, the duty of reporting. But the second, and in a sense a more profound element, was the responsibility or the taking of responsibility for the manifest failures of elements of your portfolio. And what we have seen at Petrojam is really manifest failures, perhaps not the minister taking the decisions himself, but it was his judgment as to who to appoint to that board. And it was his lack of oversight, lack of giving adequate direction and control that allowed the situation to slide and deteriorate for 2 years to become the crisis that we have here. So, Prime Minister, the first question is, you spoke to accountability, and I'm asking you if the second element of accountability, not just the obligation to report, but the more fundamental obligation, which is to take responsibility for the serious, almost catastrophic failures under your watch, is the minister not going to be held to that part of accountability as well? It's the first question. The second question, Prime Minister, is that we have a company in crisis. 42 senior managers and technical staff have departed in the past 2.5 years. And that does not include the general manager that we heard of today, which is 43. And it obviously does not yet, but must include the HR manager, which precipitated a demonstration by the staff last week. This organization now is almost without leadership. And with the greatest respect to the 3 members of the board that were appointed by the same minister who showed poor judgment in the first set of directors, those are all retired persons. This is going to take almost a full-time, certainly in the short term, attention to, but with the greatest of respect, it's going to require a level of energy, and ideally, it would require a level of knowledge of technical operations. These persons are not engineers. They're not people who have operational managers of this sort of operation.
Mr. Bunting, so, please, stick to the question.
My question to the Prime Minister is, I do not believe the arrangements that you have outlined are adequate to address the crisis at Petrojam. And I think we need something much more substantial. And I'm asking the Prime Minister, for example, you mentioned Chris Zaka as a sort of strategic person. And that's a person highly qualified unfortunately, he has a full-time job otherwise, but he's a highly qualified engineer and operations manager, the type of person. Why would he not be on the board of Petrojam, for example? The third question. The third question, on page 7 of your statement, Prime Minister, you spoke about in approving board members, or cabinet in approving board members were not always aware of the residential status of proposed members. In the instant case of the immediate past chairman of Petrojam, was cabinet aware? And if not, is this not another example of ministerial dereliction of duty? Because surely the minister would have been aware and should have informed cabinet of this very material thing. The fourth question, Prime Minister, on page 10 of your statement. On page 10 of your statement, you said that after careful consideration, all sole source retainer contracts will require prior approval by cabinet. All other retainer contracts must be brought to the attention of cabinet. And in either case, declarations regarding connected persons are to be included in the relevant submissions to cabinet. So, Prime Minister, my specific question is, in the instant case, or the two cases where we have heard of the direct procurement or the retainer contract for an entertainment management company for your oil refinery, and Asha Corporation, the advisory consultancy, are you saying, or let me ask it, in either of these cases, are there connected persons involved? And my final question has to do with your comment on the non-cooperation of the Venezuelan partners in the refinery upgrade. Prime Minister, do you think that perhaps this non-cooperation is because the Venezuelan partners were not happy with the management and governance that was taking place, and have perhaps done us a great service, because we would have probably thrown away a lot of money if we had proceeded with the level of incompetence that we have seen demonstrated in other areas? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, just answer the last question first. These matters, what I call the lack of cooperation in the upgrade with our Venezuelan brothers, predated all of this. So I wouldn't tie the two things together. But clearly, all I'm saying is that the records are clear that there were many attempts before now at upgrading the refinery. The leader of the opposition had said at one point in time, we were ready, the Venezuelans weren't. At one point, the Venezuelans were ready, we were not. I'm still looking at that point when we were not. It could have been the fallout as a result of the global financial crisis. It could have been that oil prices plummeted, which made it impossible for Venezuela to find the capital. But whatever it is, we have simply, from 2006 to now, we have not been able to, even though it is within the scope of the agreement that guides this partnership, that there should be the refinery upgrade. We simply have not done it, and that's just a matter of fact. Now, the other question asked by the the member, and just help me to remember them one by one, member. So now, connected parties. Connected party is a legal terminology. It is. They're defined in law in several acts as to what is a connected party. But when we examined all that was brought before us, we saw that, generally speaking, that retainer contracts could be a loophole through which connected parties could get benefits. And it is possibly open to abuse. And we decided that we would act. We have not seen, and we were not presented with any evidence that this is the case. But like you, we have been hearing all the rumors. We await, Mr. Speaker, we await the more thorough investigation of the constituted bodies that have the power to establish that. Once that is established, Mr. Speaker, then there is no question of the government's action, and of course, there might be very well areas of criminal prosecution involved in that as well. Oh, your other question. Just remind me. Yeah.
Just let me remind you, I asked if the minister, who must have been aware of the residential status, did he inform the cabinet of the non-residents?
I'm going from, Mr. Speaker.
And if he didn't, would this not be negligence on his part?
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to answer the member I'm going to answer you from my recollection. My recollection is that when the submission was brought, there was nothing to indicate to cabinet the residential status of the member, of the member of the board, of anyone. At the time when the chairman was appointed to the board, he was resident in Jamaica, and that is what I was informed. You've asked me to give you my answer. That is what I was informed. I'm saying to you, Mr. Speaker, if you will, let me speak to you, Mr. Speaker, because the member is not helping me at all. Mr. Speaker, I was informed by the minister that when the former chairman was appointed, he was resident. And we should bear in mind that the former chairman was not appointed as chairman. He was appointed as a board member. By virtue of the sanctions that were applied, it was thought prudent so that the company isn't seen as a Venezuelan company, that the chairmanship reflects the 49% ownership of Venezuela and the 51% ownership of Jamaica. Therefore, it would be appropriate that the chairman be Jamaican. That was, so our Venezuelan brothers agreed that they should not have this rotating 6 months chairmanship in light of the sanction that was put on. And that is a reasonable position.
I would ask you to check on those. That information.
I will check again.
At the press conference, we presented evidence to the contrary to what you have just stated. And the final question that you were to speak to, Prime Minister, well, two that you didn't speak to, was my suggestion to you that given the managerial and technical vacuum that now exists at the organization, I suggested to you that just having 3 new retired directors would not be sufficient retired persons rather as directors would not be sufficient to address that that managerial and technical vacuum, and it needed much more to be urgently injected in there. And I was asking if you're open to making those additional.
Mr. Speaker, the idea behind selecting the persons that were selected was, like the member from Central Manchester, recognizing that there needs to be a great deal of time dedicated to the governance of the board. And so I needed persons who, first of all, understood enterprise-level governance, meaning persons who have run multi-billion-dollar companies, because that requires a different level of governance. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe we have found persons who both understand financial governance, which is in itself a rare skill, and persons who understand organizational governance to manage these large corporate bodies. And I believe that the board members display that. As it relates, member, to the management issues now, it is not the role of the board to manage. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the error and the problem was the board passing that very important line between governance and management. That, to me, is a big problem. And therefore, the role of this board now is to make sure that they find the person, which is what I've said. They have been tasked now to settle the HR environment there, the industrial relation and human resource management environment, by putting in place effective and efficient leadership at the management level. Now, when the board does that, the board can hold the management accountable. But if the board is interfering and doing management job, it is very difficult to hold management to account. So I believe we have struck the right chord. Now, I'm agreeing with you to a point where we need to have technical advice as well because of the strategic direction in which we need to go, and Petrojam is a technical kind of operation, which is why we will have a kind of strategic review committee, and which is why we have selected that individual, Mr. Zaka, who has enterprise experience, corporate experience, but engineering operational experience as well, to guide this process of strategic review. So the board will be assisted. As I said, I don't have those capabilities. They will make recommendations to me, and I think the country will be well served by that. The other question that you have asked about ministerial responsibility. The second element of accountability. I'm glad you asked the question, member. And it does show that, like me, you are grappling with this issue of ministerial responsibility, and the leader of the opposition as well. Your question makes the point that accountability is a spectrum. It's a process. The first element is to account for it, meaning to report. Then the third element is sanction. And then, the second element is sanction, which is what you are asking for. And the third element is to correct, to ensure that what caused the error in the first place does not happen again. Where we are in the process is I have to engage in a process of discovery to come up with fact. Because when I come here to account, I cannot come here with things that are not factual. So once I have gone through that process and I've got the facts, proportionately and appropriately, I have acted. It has come to me as something that I can safely say is a fact, that there are issues there for which the minister could not continue to execute responsibility over the portfolio, especially while there is an investigation underway. We have acted. We have started on that process of accountability. And we have made changes as we have gone along and established where there are what we would call fatal errors that would require the person to be entirely relieved of their jobs. And as we go and we find the facts and I'm satisfied, we will act even before we get the reports of the Integrity Commission and the Auditor General. And certainly when those reports come, there will be, I'm certain, further action. Now, in looking at the various principles and conventions, the and I just want to read it carefully, the Carltona principle clearly establishes that, as you have said, ministers are responsible for policy and the actions of the agencies under their. Yes, there's no question. To execute that responsibility, they come to Parliament, and they give a report. Now, as to whether or not they should resign as a result of their action, it is clear that with the complexity of modern government, whilst ministers must accept responsibility, come to Parliament and report, it is not every action that leads to resignation. And you have to examine it very carefully. Now, the member from Central Kingston, East Kingston and Port Royal said, I call for his resignation. Mr. Speaker, as leader of the opposition at the time, a major energy project went awry. Major. It wasn't just limited to energy. This was the electricity sector, the private sector company. Hold on. Clear breaches of procurement guidelines. Hold on, man. You notice a member from Central Manchester quiet. Him don't say a word. No. Hold on. Mr. Speaker, hold on. Hold on, no.
Can I allow the Prime Minister to address the Speaker?
No, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister at the time did not relieve the Minister of his portfolio. I just want to remind you of that. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister at the time instead established an enterprise team. And I question why establish this enterprise team? Why not just take the entire portfolio as a sign of accountability? Of course, no answer came. I had my initial concerns about ESET, but I will stand here today and say that ESET has done a fairly good job, in fact, a very good job in piloting the LNG. The minister will want to take account for it, but the records won't show that. The records will not show that, but yet the minister maintained his title, maintained his staff, his office. So sometimes when we speak and I read some of the hypocrisy written in the papers, I just sit back and say, we have short memories. Mr. Speaker, there was another case in which I am very happy that my words have set the standard for accountability in the country. And I don't need a leader of the opposition to remind me of those words because I still stand by them. A member of this parliament, well, thank you for the reminder, but a member of this parliament, Mr. Speaker, was not accused of mismanagement, was not accused of maladministration or dereliction of duty or poor judgment. The member was accused of something amounting to fraud. I just want us to remember that. Yes. Now, in the principle of collective responsibility, whenever a member of this House, minister or not, is accused of something that could be considered as, there's a term of art. It's not malfeasance or misfeasance. It's more misbehavior. There's a very elegant way of putting it. Misconduct, personal misconduct, or moral turpitude. Thank you, Leader of the moral turpitude. It is almost automatic that there is resignation. whenever that occurs in here, whether it is minister or MP, once there's an issue of moral turpitude, then that is the appropriate call. I made that at the time, and that was appropriate to call for it. Eventually, by public pressure, the Prime Minister saw it necessary to accept the resignation of the member. And then there was a report which pretended to clear the minister. And then he was reappointed. In the instant case, in the instant case, there are allegations being made about, as the member from Central Manchester just did, that the minister's judgment in appointing the board is called into question. What I'm saying that you have made that call. So now I have to act in a proportionate way and in an appropriate way. And in everything that I have done, even the harshest critic, Mr. Speaker, must admit that I have followed process, that I have been open and transparent, that I have not hesitated, and I have given the record of my interventions to know. And that as we seek to build this culture of accountability, take out the politics out of it for 5 minutes. Take out the politics out of it. But the culture of accountability requires a process. Because with the modern complexity of government and the swiftness of information and the ability to geometrically increase false information, governments could be bamboozled in taking action that are not correct. We have seen, Mr. Speaker, that now agents can use the media, traditional and social media, to peddle false information, half-truths, and alternative facts, to sway public opinion. As Prime Minister, I cannot fall prey to that. My job is to come here in the principle of accountability, Mr. Speaker, to establish what the facts are as quickly as possible and act as quickly as possible. And this government has done that, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister, I just want to pick up where you left off. You have indicated your commitment to accountability, to transparency, to openness. Will you make public the report that the acting permanent secretary has provided to you on the state of the operations at Petrojam, so that the public can know what you know in terms of the facts? First question. Can you also indicate whether the separation of the general manager today is an acknowledgement of his own role in the many breaches that have taken place at Petrojam? And based on the facts that you have, you came to that conclusion. If that is so, can you tell us when will other managers at Petrojam, whom you have enough information about in terms of their own roles in the many breaches that have taken place, when those separations will take place? Third, is your government prepared to use mutual legal assistance or, in the direct case, extradition to deal with persons who may be accused of criminal offenses related to Petrojam who are not resident in Jamaica? Fourth, I would like to caution you, Prime Minister. You indicated you are personally going to take on the energy portfolio. Well, let me ask. In your response to the member from East Kingston and Port Royal, I got the impression that you were going to personally assume the portfolio. Well, you should clarify whether you are. My caution was going to be,
given the complexity of that portfolio, it requires someone who has undivided attention. But you can clarify and indicate whether you are personally going to take on the responsibilities as Energy Minister. And finally, my colleague from Central Manchester asked about the role of what may be called the ZACA committee. And we have no issue with the person. What I would want to know is whether that committee would assume, for example, oversight of the upgrading of the VDU as an example, where $120 million has been estimated to do this project, given the litany of breaches that already exist. Yeah, when would our terms of reference be developed so that we could critically analyze the work of this committee?
Member, we're presently working, I'm starting with your last question first. We're presently working on the terms of reference. I think it is something that if you have a particular thing that you feel should be included in the terms of reference, please send it to me. I'm open to have it considered. We have not finalized the terms of reference. Normally in these things, you want to at least identify all the members, and then you have a discussion with them. They can help to identify elements of the terms of reference. So I'm not going to close that off. Participation is welcome. If you have things, please let me know. In terms of whether or not I will personally manage it, in the interim, I will personally hold the portfolio until, as I have indicated, that there has to be some changes and redistribution of the workload. Remind me of the other question. Well, remember, I was indicating to you that it was unfair to ask me when other managers are going to be dismissed. As the minister, what I give is general policy direction, and I've given a policy direction to the Jamaican members of the board, who I suspect will seek to convene and communicate with the other members, that we need to settle the HR and management there to provide leadership, and settling it means to ensure that there are no more industrial relations disruption. So it is both in terms of system and staff. So I'm certain that they're going through following the process, and there will be changes at the management, the senior management level at Petrojam. That just has to happen in order for the organization to turn around. If you're asking me about whether or not we're going to use extradition, that is not a decision for the cabinet. And I just want to be clear on that the new framework for anti-corruption has an independent body. And because it is an independent body, I didn't even suggest that I was going to ask them to investigate. So if they feel that extradition is necessary, the Attorney General's Department and the Minister of Justice is there to facilitate. And the DPP, there to facilitate.
Mr. Prime Minister, through you, Mr. Speaker, picking up on the last point from the member from Southeast St. Andrew, the general manager, you said, indicated a separation. Was it that the board or the government requested, or he indicated his intention to separate? That's one question. Two, I had the benefit of the presentation from the management at the PAAC. And what came out at the PAC meeting is that the HR manager was hired contrary to what the policies and hiring procedures are at Petrojam. Much have been said, yes, that was the report that came by the acting general manager at the last sitting of the PAAC. Mr. As a matter, you made much, Prime Minister, about facts and not speculation. No, the hiring of the HR manager.
Sir, on a point of order, Mr. Speaker. If I may, on a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Taylor.
Mr. Speaker, just to indicate that Mr. Speaker, I was at the PAAC meeting last
What's
week,
the point of
Tuesday.
order?
The point of order is as it relates to the appointment of the HR manager. A statement was made. I'm sorry? Anyways, yes, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to the appointment of the HR manager indicated that there was an ad placed in the paper. She responded to the ad. She was interviewed, Mr. Speaker, and somewhere between December and February, some 65 days or 59 days, Mr. Speaker, that the process of interviewing took place and she was offered the job. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not quite sure what procedure would have been broken in that regard. If you see an ad in a newspaper, respond to the ad, and thereafter you get the job some 2 months later.
Mr. Speaker, the committee's meeting was a public meeting. Everybody heard what took place. As a matter of fact, Prime Minister, the former HR manager was terminated on the 23rd of December. The 23rd of December. There was an ad in the paper subsequently. Remember that 23rd, then you have Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and Boxing Day. And then you go to New Year's Day. So you see it's virtually a dead period. Right? Between those few days between Christmas. An ad went out in the paper for the HR manager's position, for which response was required by the 6th of January. That would be after New Year's Day. It would be 5 days. The ad went out sometime before the 1st of January. Mr. Speaker, 1 week, 10 days maximum, given the holiday period. 1st of January, the ad went out for response by the 6th for a senior management position. Senior management position for a major industrial complex. That for me and for other members of the committee was highly unusual. Highly unusual. There would not, on the surface of it, Prime Minister, on the surface of it, even staff members would not have enough time to consider and make a decision to apply for that position, much less members of the public to apply. So that on the surface of it, Prime Minister, we don't need any further investigation. The minutes of the PAC is of record that you can consult, and I have no doubt you had the opportunity to consult with the staff. I have a problem with that, Prime Minister, in terms of the process, the procedure of engaging such a senior member. So I would love to get your response to that. Third, Prime Minister, from the deliberations of the PAAC, the HR manager and the HR department headed by the HR manager makes the decision on donations. So all those donations that you spoke of, for which you have postulated new guidelines, but to be promulgated, right? All of those decisions that warrant which you spoke of was led by the HR manager hired in the process that I made reference of earlier. Fourth, the HR manager took office on the 13th of February, 2017. And by the 24th of March, the HR manager presented the payroll change form to change her salary from the entry point of $7.9 million then to $13 million. That is in 49 days between the 13th of February and the 24th of March. she presented the payroll change form to change her salary from $7.9 to $13 million.
What percentage is that? What percentage?
I question, Prime Minister, to you, as you are concerned more with facts, if this can be refuted, doesn't that indicate severe breach, and the incumbent would be the beneficiary of those breaches? Next question, Prime Minister. It was conveyed at the PAAC that during the tenure of the last management, the board chairman was always living abroad in Maryland. That was the report that came to the PAAC. Never lived there during that time. No, Mr. Prime Minister, given that long duration of residence abroad for a major corporation like the Petrojam, you spoke about the importance of our economy, the energy sector, and Petrojam. Wouldn't you say, Mr. Prime Minister, that the minister so in charge of the oversight of such major entity and a board that is overseeing its operation ought not to have known that the chairman so in charge of the board lives abroad? And if the minister ought to have known, wouldn't you consider it pertinent for the minister to so advise you as Prime Minister and the cabinet, if given that he knew that the chairman was living abroad throughout that tenure, throughout his tenure as chairman? My next question, Prime Minister, is the former chairman a member of any other boards, such as PCJ and JARS? And lastly, in your ascertaining the facts, Prime Minister, have you sought to get the notes or minutes of the PAAC meetings where the information about the operations of Petrojam was provided?
Prime Minister, before you answer, my first question wasn't answered, whether in your attempt to be accountable, whether you will release the report from the acting permanent secretary.
Your question first, member. Recall last week that I had, not last week, the week before, that I had indicated that the report came as a submission, as a cabinet submission. So it's not the norm to release cabinet submissions. What we agreed was that we would turn over the report to the Auditor General, who could then take what was in that report and compile it along with her report. But there was nothing really in the report that is secret. So I will, yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's nothing in the report that is secret. So I will discuss it with the Cabinet Secretary and make the report public. It's not an issue. For us, it's not an issue. Remember your question about the residential status of, starting with your last question first, with the residential status of the board member, of the chairman. Well, board member then, and then chairman after. As it has turned out, residential status is now an important fact. At the time, it wasn't. If the board chairman was executing his job without issue, it would not have arisen, and therefore it is difficult for me to convict the minister on an issue that was not an issue at the time. So if it were, which we have now made it, that it is now a duty of the minister to report, and the minister does not report. I'm just answering you. It doesn't say, however, that good judgment should not have prevailed. Right? It doesn't say that, but it was not a duty. That's Is it? No, but I'm answering his question. He asked that question. Yeah, so. Is it the art? Just remind me, member, of your other question. Right. No. So the question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons why I'm able to stand here, member, and answer the questions, and I can't say I'll be able to answer every question you have asked, but because I've gone through this process of discovery, I do have some information, including having reports from the members of the PAAC, and I get even reports at home. All right, and I've had occasion to ask for the minutes of your meetings, and not all of them, but to get information on some. And I have asked the management of Petrojam about the hiring and dismissal practices. In fact, that's a substantial part of the report. Now, I have formed my own opinions, but I'm not going to say what my opinions are. I'm going to await the Auditor General, because as it has turned out, there are some accusations that have been made which, on the face of it, they are serious, but we need documentation. And I've learned to rely on that because, for example, we have been told, hold on. Yes, that yes, that on the face of it, they are serious and they sound serious, but we need documentation. Because, for example, we were told about certain qualifications, but then as you proceed, you hear it is not there or you can't find documentation. So I would want to, before I form my final opinion and take decisions, I would want to hear what the Auditor General report is saying, and I'm happy to hear that the Auditor General has said she's going to have her report in, I think I heard 6 weeks. Well, from when she said it, probably would have been 5 weeks now. So that's I can wait for that. I can wait for that. But remember, to be specific with what you have said, the responsibility for that kind of action stops at the general manager. Stop, because what would happen is that the board is responsible for the general manager, and some, not all senior, but then the general manager is responsible for his staff. And so it's the accountability for that kind of hiring would start there. It doesn't relieve the board. And if there is ministerial interference, which is what I hear being bandied about, if there is, and again, I don't have proof of that. But that's the whole point. Yes, then if there is interference in the process, which there shouldn't be, and the minister spoke about ministerial overreach, that is also a danger, then there will be action. That is clear as day. But let me just be clear on that, Mr. Speaker. Let me share that information, because somehow there is this notion that I don't want to act. I have said to the minister directly that if there is any hint of that in this matter, then there's nothing I could do other than to accept his resignation. So the point that I'm making is that no, there is a clear position that we have taken as a government. We're not hiding anything. We're not seeking to cover up anything. Right? Now, what I have heard, hold on. What I have heard is this talk that there is ministerial overreach and association. Now, if association is the case, Mr. Speaker, many of you over here, including you, including you, member, and I don't usually point, but for emphasis, could have been accused of having persons hired to entities which were related to you. We don't know that. That was never questioned. We never made an issue of it. We never go out and made an issue of that. And I am saying to you that mere association is not enough to convict and disqualify. I have to have more. Because if that were the case, you could have been convicted to member.
Talk. Prime Minister. Yes. Prime Minister. Prime Minister. No. Okay.
I'd ask about the general manager being asked to resign or he offered his resignation.
Remember, once the new board took over, we had a discussion about the state of management. The board drew the conclusion that there obviously needed to be strengthening of the management and leadership. And I was advised today that the conversation about a change had reached a point where the general manager is now separate from the company. I use that language because I am not personally involved in the discussion. I want to keep it as vague as that until I actually know, see the physical letter that describes how the separation took place. But I was just advised that the separation is effective.
I have one question I would like to ask you. Oh, you finish?
The former board chairman and the other boards, such as
yes,
JAR.
I asked the question. I hear that yes, he's on other boards, but I will get a definitive answer tomorrow on to exactly which boards he's on, and then I will have to take some actions after that. No, I've asked the question. I'm going to get the report tomorrow. I wanted to get it in time. But all kinds of things happen. I didn't get the report in time. But when I get the report, I will take some action. And I will inform the public what the action is.
Nothing is anecdotal. It's fact.
Prime Minister. Page 10 of your statement, I've had intensive briefing on the energy portfolio in relation to policy matters and general administration of the portfolio. Page 10, generally speaking, based on my briefing and questioning, I'm not seeing a general policy or administrative failure in the energy division, but clearly there are specific issues at Petrojam, which some of them you have mentioned, some in the public domain. These points to failures in corporate governance and breakdown in accountability. And in another part, you refer to the haystack of allegation. I like the how you coin it, haystack of allegations. My question to you, in your intensive briefing with the people at Petrojam, senior management, did you ask them or did they tell you why in the haystack of allegations, 74% of all their procurement of Petrojam in the last 2 years has been by, what do you call it, private, sole sourcing? Did they say to you, because this is in the public domain, the emergency procurement powers are very specific, and I understand the procurement law very well, because I had oversight for it. And we all know, and you need to learn, come to my school, right? I'm a teacher now. Did they tell you, because it is one of the topical things in public domain, in the haystack of allegations, that 75%, which amounts to billions of dollars, that the management of Petrojam the management, board, etc., use the sole sourcing and emergency procurement method to do this procurement? And if not, you're now the minister, will you find that out and tell us why they choose this method?
Remember, a part of the report that we got spoke to some of those procurement issues. I can't accept or deny the figure that you have given. That is something that I think more details would have to go. 75% in what year, over what period of time? Well, I'm not going to argue the point, but two things I would say for context. One, it is not unusual for public bodies to use sole sourcing. Many large organizations do, but there are strong governance procedures. In this instance, the governance procedures are in question. I am not one who favors any large, wide-scale use of the sole sourcing methods. There are times when you use them because you have strategic opportunity. No, emergency, no, but you're not saying that 75% of procurement was used under emergency regulations. That's not what you're saying. That's what you're saying?
That's what it's implying.
I want to be clear. Is that what you're saying? That 75% of procurement at Petrojam was using emergency procedure?
Procurement method, I said it, I refer to your words, is that of allegation.
Oh, okay. All right. Yes.
So I'm not saying because I have not, we're doing in our investigation, how did they do it? But I'm saying what is in the public domain is that 74% of all the procurement in the last 2 years, this board, and the board sign off on these things. The emergency method was used. And in using the emergency method, because the emergency is a methodology of procurement, they use a sole source. So you declare an emergency and then you go to one person. That's a sole source. So it's two things in the procurement, You trigger in the emergency method, which is for national disaster, emergency of this, whatever. That's what the emergency procurement method means. National security at risk, commuters at risk, etc. But they use that all the while for 74% of their procurement, emergency.
Remember,
and in doing that, use the sole source.
Remember, I'm just standing to my feet because, whilst you're speaking, because we could all agree that that would be outrageous. If that is the case, and since you have raised it, that has not come to my attention. I will. First thing in the morning, the permanent secretary is here. I'm saying it in front of everybody. Permanent secretary, please pull that information for me tomorrow. Well, we will. As I said, I've just received a physical copy, so I have not a chance to review.
House Leader.
No, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I heard the Prime Minister in the statement suggest that some of the remedies that he's putting in place is because of an absence of some guidelines that you thought were necessary, and that some of the weaknesses that you saw at Petrojam could be systemic weaknesses. My question against that background then is, are you